Hey there, creepy peeps. Welcome to my channel. If you are new here, welcome back. If you are returning, today, as the title's down here now. The title suggests, I'm going to be grading various horror decades. Before I do that, really quick, I just want to say a huge thank you for 4,000 of you that are subscribed to me. Like, what might seem weird comparatively to like so many other YouTube channels that have tens and hundreds of thousands and millions of more subscribers than I do, to be, you know, saying thank you for 4,000. But honestly, I could do a thank you like every single video because I appreciate each and every one of you. I truly do. I just wanted to say a quick like official thank you. I did thank you guys on my social media when it actually happened, but I just wanted to address all of you right now. I love you. Thank you. Okay, now on to the video. So one of my patrons kind of brought up an idea to give each year in the past decade a grade. But in my live stream last week, 2 weeks ago, last week, I don't remember when it was now, I talked about my favorite horror movies from each decade. I kind of wanted to do something slightly different. And then in our ongoing like Skype chat we have for my Patreon page, we were all talking about our favorite decades of horror, and the 5 that got brought up the most were the 70s, 80s, 90s, aughts, and the 10s. Are we calling it the 10s? I don't really know. Okay, now finally starting the video, we're gonna go in chronological order and start with the 70s, which were characterized by movies that questioned whether God was real, movies that showed that man still had to fear animals, and movies that opened the floodgates of violence after the ending of the production code. So when I think of the 70s, I think of those like hyper violent movies like The Last House on the Left, like The Hills Have Eyes, like Texas Chainsaw Massacre, because it feels like horror was like stretching its limbs after being in a straitjacket for too long. Do you know what I mean? Like to me, the 70s are characterized by those extremely violent movies that I think had like everything to do with the production code no longer being a thing. Although it's not my favorite or go-to decade for horror, so at least for me, like my personal preferences, I think if I were giving this a grade, I'd give the 70s a C+. Now we're all familiar with the 80s. Vice proceeds, slice and dice, teenagers being teenagers and paying the ultimate price for it. The 80s nostalgia flicks that we got and TV shows that we got the past couple of years, last decade, made me a little bit tired of the 80s, I gotta say. I understand that, again, that's people's personal preferences, and there's that like 30-year rule or whatever for nostalgia media. I don't really know. So it, you know, it went from like a couple of years ago when I started my channel, it still wasn't my favorite decade, but I really liked slasher movies. I felt over the course of this channel, man, if you guys have been here since day one, you've seen me like fall out of love with the 80s. I just need a break. I don't hate them, I just need a break. So if I were to give it a grade, I'd give it a C. So the 90s. The 90s were a crazy time. On one hand, the horror films of the day were exploring science and technology gone too far. On the other hand, horror films were also focused on the human monsters, serial killers. And on a completely different third hand was the slasher revival with like the meta slashers, the postmodern, you know. Every time I think of the 90s, I never like really think of a distinct type of movie like I do with the 80s. Like to me, 80s is synonymous with slasher, and I feel like it's that way for a lot of people, even though obviously there were more than just slashers coming out in the 80s. But for the 90s, I don't think of one particular type of horror movie. To me, it's just like a smorgasbord of different styles. And I don't know, maybe if I was just making a guess, I would think maybe that has something to do with the 80s being predominantly slasher. Like to have a whole decade characterized by one type of horror movie, I feel like the 90s was like, let's try all these different things. That's what I like about the 90s, that there's so many different horror movies. You can watch like the more serious, dark, thrillery, serial killer movies like The Sixth Sense, which is not a serial killer, but just darker. Silence of the Lambs. You could go like off the walls with something like In the Mouth of Madness. The meta slashers, of course, like Scream. There's just so many different styles to choose from. Not only was there variety, it was variety well done, at least in my opinion. So if I were giving the 90s a grade, it would be a B+. So the aughts, or the 00s, I don't know, I just call them the aughts. Reflecting the horrors of 9/11 and the war in Iraq that followed, we saw a huge influx of zombie horror movies and a new subgenre of horror, torture porn. The aughts are my soft spot decade. This is my nostalgia decade. I was born in 92, so the aughts were really the time where I was exploring horror to the fullest, like really checking out movies. Large part of this decade I was in middle school and high school, so this is when I was going to the movies a lot, going to see horror movies like every weekend, and like I've mentioned before, sneaking into some R-rated movies. This was the decade that I really discovered horror as a young person, so hopefully you guys can understand why I have such a love for the aughts. It's the same reason why some people have love for the 80s, because those were the movies that they saw growing up. There were also a good number of horror remakes in, like, I feel like the latter half of this decade and the early half of the tens. I still don't know what to call that. And those movies that I get hate for sometimes for even daring to like House of Wax, even though it's not like a franchise or whatever, but Friday the 13th, stuff like that. A lot of those movies were my introduction to the original. So I have a soft spot for this whole decade. So many of my like top 10 horror movies of all time. Have I done a video on those? I don't actually know. If I haven't, let me know if you want to see that in the comment section. I can go over my top 10 movies of all time. They're all horror. But so many of my ultimate like top 10 are from this decade. So this grade should not surprise anybody. I give the aughts an A+. This is my favorite decade of horror. All of a sudden I dropped down to 1,000 subscribers. So the tens, this past decade. It's the toughest to define, at least right now, because we're not even 2 months out of it, you know. But the first word that comes to mind is the hotly debated term elevated horror, which became popular in the last half of this decade. But as of right now, besides the elevated horror, I don't see a trend really. Kind of like the 90s almost. I feel like it was another kind of like smorgasbord kind of decade. Speaking of the term like elevated horror, I've seen so many articles about it, like, should we call it elevated horror? You know, is it actually elevated or is it just different? Blah, 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 blah. I personally don't agree with the term elevated horror. I don't think it's a thing. I think it's just more accessible. At least when I was getting into horror in the aughts, like I mentioned, I feel like I didn't know anybody else that was into horror movies. I just dragged my friends along because I could, and a lot of times I just could convince them that there was nothing else better to see at the movies at that time. Whereas now I feel like it's so easy to connect not only to other horror fans, but even filmmakers. And that just goes in general. I mean, think about like the Sonic movie, like literally fans changed the way Sonic looked because of social media. Like, how insane is that? It's still a very niche community, of course, but I feel like with these like elevated horror movies, they're getting talked about by so many people outside of the community. I think that we're going to find that the tens this past decade was the start of horror becoming way more accessible to so many more people. So much more people. And for that, I gotta give the past decade an A. My personal ranking of the past 5 decades are as follows: 80s, 70s, 90s, 10s, and aughts. I feel like that's just gonna be opposite from like everybody in my comments. I don't know how much that ranking would change if I added in every single decade. If you're interested, let me know in the comments and I can make a part 2 to this, and I can give you a final ranking with every single decade of horror. Really quick, before I end this video, I want to say thank you to my creepy patron peeps for their support of my channel. If you want to find out the perks to being a creepy patron peep yourself, you can follow that link in the description. And if you just, you know, made it to the end of this video, thank you. And if you liked it, if you wouldn't mind hitting that thumbs up button, it really does help me out. You can also subscribe, become a creepy peep today. I post videos Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. And if you want to, you can ring that notification bell and see if it works. I don't know, maybe in 2020 it's actually gonna start working now. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, stay strange. Bye.